We'll review in Ritz Hashem the main points of the Gemara itself that we did yesterday on the bottom of Daf Gimel Amud Aleph. The Gemara asks a twofold question: Minyanin de Rachel Lemutei Mai, Minyanin de Seifa Lemutei Mai. And on the top of Daf Gimel Amud Beis, the Gemara presents Lemutei de Rav, and that's going to be the case of Tzaras Sota, and Udarav Asi, and that's the case of Tzaras Islandus. And let's go through very quickly the cases here. If a woman became a Sota, and then her husband dies, she also has a Tzara. So Shimon was married to two women. We said Sarah and Rivka, and Sarah was a Sota. She's Asur al-Baila. Rav, in the Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph, derives from Psukim that she's out of Yibum. And not only is she out of Yibum, but once having excluded her from Yibum, she goes back to the state of Eishes Ach. She's an Erva, and she therefore sets up Rivka, Hatzara, as a Tzaras Erva. Rav Asi talks about a case where Shimon has two wives, one of which turns out to be an islandess, and she doesn't fall for Yibum because the pasuk says Asher Teled, and that excludes an islandess. She therefore becomes an Eishes Ach, and her Tzara, we'll call her Rivka, is a Tzaras Erva. The Gemara continues and asks L'Rav, U'Rav Asi Lemutei Mai, since Rav would expand the numbers of our Mishnah from 15 to 16, including Tzaras Sota, whose status is equal to a Tzaras Erva, and Rav Asi would expand the number 15 in our Mishnah to include Tzaras Islandus, then why would the Mishnah mention the number? What is it coming to exclude? And the Gemara says the following: Isvir Luladadi, if they agree one to the other, then we're going to need two miyutim. And the first miyut is Chada Lemutei Tzaras Mima Enes, that if Shimon marries two wives, one of which is a Yesoma Ketana, we'll call her Sarah. She was married off by her brother or her mother. And he's also married to a second wife, we'll call her Rivka. If Shimon, dies below Banim, and both of his wives, Sarah and Rivka, fall for Yibum to Reuven, and this wife, the Ketana, by the name of Sarah, was Mema'enis Reuven, and with that miyun, she goes free without a get, and therefore she's no longer considered included in the Zikas Yibum. And now Hatzara, by the name of Rivka, also becomes Asura L'Ruven as far as Yibum is concerned. But that's only D'Rabbanan. On a Doraisa level, Sarah is not married to Shimon because Miyun completely removes that Ishus D'Rabbanan. However, there was a Gzeira that was instituted that people might come to be matir even the Tzara of an Erevas Ketana. And in this case, although the Tzara, Rivka, of Sarah the Ketana does not fall for Yibum because the Rabbanan blocked Yibum because of this Gzeira, but nevertheless she will require Chalitza. And in our Mishnah, there are listed 15 women whose Sarah is Ptura not only from Yibum but also from Chalitza. In the case of Ma'enes, she only generates an Isser on her Tzara vis-a-vis Yibum, but not vis-a-vis Chalitza. And therefore, the minion of our Mishnah is coming to exclude Tzaras Mima'enes. What about the second minion? And Chada Lemu'utei Tzaras Machzir Grushasa. Liacher Sheniseis Liacher means that Shimon is a Kohen, and he divorces one of his two wives by the name of Sarah. She gets married to someone else, and then Shimon remarries her. He's got an Isser Lav in any relationship he would have with Sarah once she was married to another man. And in this case, like in the case of Tzaras Mima'enes, not only does is Sarah excluded from Yibum because of the Isser, in this case of Machzir Grushasa, but Sarah now excludes Hatzara, Rivka, from Yibum. However, they both are chayav in chalitza. And as we said yesterday, there's a fundamental difference between Tsaras Sota and Tsaras Machzir Gushaso. Tsaras Sota, we said, was inherent in the Ishus, but Tsaras Machzir Gushaso is a separate Isur. So there's going to be a Chiyuv Chalitza, and therefore the minyan in our Mishnah is coming to exclude the case of Tsaras Machzir Gushaso. Now that works all, and that implication of two miutim, that's assuming that both Rav and Rav Asi agree with each other. If they don't agree with each other, then chada lemute chavre, v'chad lemute od tzoras memaynes, od tzoras machzir gushasa. Means that if, let's say, Rav rejects Rav Asi, then one of the two miutim is coming to exclude tzoras memaynes, and if Rav Asi rejects Rav, then one of the two miutim is coming to exclude tzoras sota. What is the other miut for each one respectively? It's going to be either to exclude tzaras memaynes or tzaras machzir gushasa. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute, according to Rav and according to Rav Asi, the Mishnah is lacking. It's missing a 16th number and even a 17th number, perhaps. It's missing tzaras sota, according to Rav. It's missing tzaras islandis, according to Rav Asi. Why didn't the Mishnah include these? And the Gemara answers, Lefi she'ena b'tzaras tzara, meaning that all the cases in our Mishnah, the 15 arayos, have one important common denominator. Because there's a din of erva, that din of erva applies and is related specifically, it's earmarked and limited to one of the brothers. So that if, for example, Shimon marries Reuven's, his brother's daughter, then she's Bito Lagabi Reuven. She has no relationship to Levi, and therefore we could have Tsaras Sota. If after Shimon dies, you could have a situation where Levi was Miyamim, the daughter of Reuven, and that's fine, because the daughter of Reuven is only an erva on Reuven, not on Levi. And then Levi dies, and now we're going to have a situation of Tsaras Sota. But in these two cases, of Sota and islandis, all the brothers are equal. You can't in any way single out one brother and say that there's an erva relationship vis-a-vis one brother. When we take the Itzer that was Chal vis-a-vis the deceased brother, and we apply it to the Beis Hayibum, to the entire household, it applies equally to Reuven, Levi, Yehudi, Issachar, all of them. And therefore, you can never come up with a scenario of tzaras sora. Our Mishnah is giving you 15 cases of arayos, and the lowest common denominator of all 15 is that there is tzaras sora. Those other cases, which should have been included in the 15, because there is a tour of Yibum and Chalitza, going to Rav and Rav Asi, each one respectively, that applies to the tzara as well, but it cannot apply to the tzaras tzara. So that's just a review of what we learned yesterday. And now, I'd like to refer back to page Yudalid that we began yesterday in the Yalkut HaBiurim. The last thing that we discussed yesterday was a problem in understanding the Nemukei Yosef. The Nemukei Yosef vacillates back and forth about the status of Eishes Kohen Shenensa. This was a case that was not addressed explicitly in our sugya, but is very relevant and very similar to the Gemara's discussion about Rav, because Rav says that in the case of a tzaras sota, she's excluded from Yibum, and she excludes her tzara from Yibum. That was Rav. And the Nemukei Yosef should now perhaps apply the same yardstick and the same halacha to the case of Eishes Kohen Shenensa, because like the case of Sota, she's included in the Isser of the Nitma, based on the fact that she had a relationship with another man. In the case of Sota, she had a relationship that was Gili Arayis. In the case of an Ones, she had a relationship that was Gili Arayis with no fault of her own, but nevertheless it generates an Isser on the Baal who's a Kohen. Now the Muki Yosef, to our surprise, vacillates about this point, and he's unsure. He thinks possibly that even if I hold like Rav in the case of Tzara Sota, I might differentiate and contrast Sota with the case of Machzir Gushasa. And based on the Beis Shmuel, we're going to try to get an insight into why there should be a difference between Sota and Eshes Kohen Sheninsa when both of them are also under the same identical category called Tumah. And Maishna Eshes Kohen Sheninsa, Umaishna Sota She Nivaloli Acher. In both cases, they're Asurim al Baila Mishum Tumah. And that's Gemara later on Daf Nun Hey. So that if a Baal would have a relationship with his wife who's a Sota, then he violates the Isur Tumah, he gets Malchus for that. And Rav says that in such a case with Sarah of a Sota, she's Ketura Minayibu, and the same thing should apply to Eshes Kohen Shenensa, that Baila Loka Mishum Tumah. And here we introduced a breakthrough shita of Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz. Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz in Masechet Nedarim sets up a fundamental difference between Sota and Machzir Gushasa. Whereas in the case of Sota, the Isser is two-directional. It applies not only to the Baal if he would have an intimacy with his wife who's a Sota, but equally applies to the Sota herself if she has an intimacy with her husband. In the case of Eshes Kohen Shenensa, by contrast, the Isser, says Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz, is exclusively on the Baal. It doesn't apply to the wife of the Baal. In other words, even though she was Nensa, and therefore her status vis-a-vis her husband who's a Kohen is that of Tumah, and she's Asur al Baila, but she doesn't have the Isser, he has the Isser. That Tumah is relevant to the desecration of Kedushas Kahuna. And now we come to the final conclusion, and that is that the halacha of Tzara, the din that an erva patters up Hatzara, is derived from Achos Isha. In the case of the erva of Achos Isha, it's a two-directional Isha. A man is not allowed to have a relationship with his wife's sister, and she's not allowed to have a relationship with her sister's husband. So that's a two-way street. And if we're deriving the tour of Sarah from Achos Isha, we can only do so in a case that's similar to Achos Isha. The area of Achos Isha is two-dimensional, whereas the Isser of Kohen, Eshes Kohen Shenensa is only one-directional, according to this Kiddush of Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz. Tosfos raises the following objection to Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz from a Gemara here in Yevamot on Daf Pei Dalet and Beis, that Gam Noshim Hisrabu LeIser Bia Shal Kahuna. When the pasuk says that a Kohen is not allowed to marry a Grusha or a Zona, it says, or a Chalola, it says Lo Yikachu. And the Torah addresses the Kohen in the plural, the grammatical plural form. And the Gemara derives from that the Torah is addressing not only him, in other words, the Kohen, but also his wife. She's also I shouldn't say his wife, I'm sorry. And she, the Zona or the Chalola, etc., is also included in the Isser of having a relationship with a Kohen. It's a two-directional Isser. So how do we reconcile Rabbi Eliezer Mimetz in the case of Eshes Kohen Shenensa with the pasuk in the drasha Here in Yevamot from Lo Yikachu, and then the Yehuda just 3 centuries ago comes up with the following answer: Lo nisravu hanoshim el bisurim haksuvim beparsha zu. In other words, there are 2 different parshios in the Torah that generate an isur with regard to a Kohen whose wife was Nensa. One parsha is the parsha of Lo Yikachu, which is a general parsha for all women that are asuros al kahuna, like a zona, chalola, or a grusha. There in that parsha, the Torah says Lo Yikachu to include that woman who's a zona, chalola, or a grusha in the Isser of having a relationship with the Kohen. But there's another parsha, and that's the parsha of Tumah. And in the parsha of Tumah, there was no ribui to include the Nashim as well. And therefore, Rabbi Elazar Metz is correct from the perspective of the Isser Tumah. That's the focus of our discussion here, to generate an Isser Tzara, which was derived from Tumah, because the secret password Tumah creates a quasi-erva status, even though it's only Chayve Lavin, but we find in the Parashat of Arayos, Chayve Krisis, and more, that the Torah calls it Tumas Arayos, right? Lo Sutamu B'hem. And here also, in the context of Eishes Kohen Nensa, the Torah calls it Tumah. But Rabbi Elazar Metz is right that the Torah calls it Tumah only vis-a-vis the Kohen, but not vis-a-vis Eishes Kohen, who in this case, Nebuch, by virtue of the fact that she had this rape situation, is a zona. But what we want to study now is a kasha of the hafla. So this you'll see on page Tes Vav. If I remember correctly, I have to review this. Hafla was the Rav in Frankfurt am Main. I think his last name was horrible, but you can look that up in Google if you have the time. In any event, the Hafla asks the following kasha. The Gemara says later on that there's a difference in the perspective of Rav between the following 2 cases. One case is where his wife Vaday Zinsa. In other words, they were Eidim to testify, and there's no doubt about it. It's absolutely certain that she is a Sota. As opposed to the case of a Sota who had Kinui and Stira, but we never produced Eidim on the Bia itself, on the Znutz itself. And the Gemara is going to tell us that Rav Shita about Sora Sota only applies in the case of Vadezin. So when we have Eidim to testify about the Znutz. However, in the case of a Sota at Kinui and Stira, and we have no proof positive that she had this bias nus, and that's a safek. She's not allowed to have relations with her husband, but nevertheless, she's not considered an erva. It's only chayve lavan. And therefore, although there won't be yibum, however, there will be chalitza. We're going to require chalitza. And the reason for that is because on the side that she did not have znus during stira, she's a full-fledged Yevamot L'Shuk, and she has a zikas ibum, and certainly, therefore, she cannot marry anyone without chalitza. The hafla, why is the Gemara looking here and there to try to come up with a miut, with a case which is excluded by virtue of the minyan in our Mishnah? What is the minyan coming to exclude? It cannot be excluding a sota, because according to Rav, the same dinim that apply to all the other 15 arais apply to the sota as well. But that's only in the case of Vaday Zinsa. in the case of suffix zinsa, the halacha would be that she doesn't fall for yibum, but she requires chalitza. And that would be a perfect candidate for lemute mai. Maybe the Mishnah is coming with the number 15 to exclude the case of a suffix sota, where she and her tzara will require chalitza. A brilliant kasha. Now, the answer to this kasha, which is offered by Nafla, is very, very complicated. It's one of those, mathematical, mechanical calculations, but we'll give it a shot. He quotes a Tosfos who says, and we touched on this yesterday, that the minyan itself would not exclude Tsaras Sota and Tsaras Islanders because the Mishnah is only addressing cases that have Saras Erevim. But rather, the Gemara is asking about the Yitur, and the Gemara is assuming that Yitur is coming to exclude Saras Sota and Saras Islands. So let's just review very quickly the sheet of Tosfos. The Mishnah would not be excluding Tsaras Sota and Tsaras Islanders because they don't lend themselves to Tsaras Sota and Tsaras Tsara. But the Gemara is bothered by the fact that the Mishnah felt compelled to mention the minyan. So we understood logically that Tsaras Sota and Tsaras Islanders would not find their place in our Mishnah because they're lacking Tsaras Tsara. And that's indeed how the Gemara defends Rav and Rav Asi. Why didn't the Mishnah include Tsaras Sota and Tsaras Islanders? The answer is because the Mishnah is searching for cases of Tsaras Tsara. And these cases of Sota and Islanders don't fit into that pattern. Now we go back to the Mishnah and we're saying, all right, Tsaras Sota, Tsaras Islanders could not be included in the Mishnah because there's no Tsaras Tsara. But why does the Mishnah go out of its way to mention the number? And the answer is that Sarach Minyan Nifrad L'chol Achas Mihen. Fine. So we need a separate counting, one to exclude the case of Tsaras Sota, the other to exclude the case of Tsaras Islanders. Od Hikshu V'Tosfos. Shemesh Kachas Le Tsaras Tsara Af B'Sota. Le'inyan Aboed. The Tosfos is going to come up with a scenario of Tsaras Tsara in the case of Sota. And therefore he's going to wonder, why does the Gemara exclude Tsaras Islanders or Tsaras Sota because there's no Tsaras Tsara? I have a case of Tsaras Tsara as far as the Boel is concerned. So Mirz Hashem, but we never will go through that diagram, that scenario. Tells you here in footnote number Ches, Dibra Maskell Lefi. All right, so Belin will get to that a little bit later on. How you can have a Tsar in the case of Sota vis-a-vis the Boel. Now, Tosfos gives a few answers, but in one of his answers, he says that Le'inyan Boel ain't Tumas HaSota Nechsheves Kis Tumas Arayos Liyibum. Lefishalo Nemra Tuma Biloshon Lav El Gabi Al Bilvad. So with regard to the Boel, we don't have this equation, this upgrade of Tumas Sota to Tumas Arayos, as far as Yibum is concerned. Lefizeh, the Efshalom Minyan Echad Ba HaMishnah Lemait Suffix Sota. Rubiyan Hasheni Lemait Tsaras Mema Enes, so Tsaras Matzigushaso. Shareim Kain Loma Tsarat Shnei Minyanim. Halodai Lemait Eshtein Bimashmos Minyan Echad Bilvad. The Shuvlo Nuchal Tarit She'ein Mashmos Haminyan Mima'etis Tzara Soto Vishenim B'Tzara Tzara Shreim Kain Hoisa Havamina B'Safek Soto Chike Erva Behechrech Sha'af Tuma Shenever B'Lashon Essay Nechsheves Ki Erva Le'inyan Ibum V'Im Kain Aflagabi Boel Yeshla Liftar Es Tzarasa V'Shuv Yeshna Vitzaras Sor. Now, if you followed that answer, Nafla, you're an absolute genius. I'm going to leave it out because I'm very excited about the next piece here. And we'll see, if we have the koach, to go back and see if we can understand the answer of the Nafla. I mean, it's like a whole Chad Gadya. It depends upon many different assumptions and calculations. The Gemara says, "L'Rav u'Rav Asi listminu," meaning, why didn't the Mishnah actually include Tzaras Sota according to Rav, Tzaras Islanders according to Rav Asi? Why were they left out of the Mishnah? After all, their status is absolutely identical to that of all the arayos that are listed in the Mishnah. And L'das Rov Rishonim Asoti Ke'erva Gmurlin Yibum Varei Poteres Es Tzarosa Af Min HaChalitza. The very underlying premise of this Gemara's question is that Tzaras Sota should be Poter Min HaYibum U'Min HaChalitza. Otherwise, why is the Gemara bothered by the fact that Tzaras Sota is not listed in the Mishnah? If it would be listed in the Mishnah, there would be a p'tur of both Yibum and Chalitza. But yet, to our shock, L'shitas Hara'ah, Rabbeinu Aaron HaLevi, one of the great Rishonim of Chachmei Sfarad, who's quoted by the Ritva here in this sugya, Me'achar, the Afla Baila, Eina Sota Asura El Be'isur Lav, is Aflin in Yibum Dina Kechayve Lavim Shemina Torah Hein Misyamos Lo Nesu El Be'Shmir. Wow. Listen to the Ra'ah. The Ra'ah is saying that with regard to Chayve Lavim, we're going to distinguish between the first intimacy and the second. On the first intimacy, when he's Makayim the mitzvah of Yibum, we can apply the principle of Esei Docha Losas. So the mitzvah Esei of Yibum overrides the Losas of Sota Labaila. The problem is that once he's Miyabimo with the first beer, he's going to likely have a second beer with him. In the second beer, he's not being Makayim the mitzvah of Yibum. He already is Makayim the mitzvah of Yibum with the first beer. If that be the case, he has no Esei to be Docha the Losas. And since a Sota is Asur Labaila, with an Isur Lotase, then there's no possibility of his having intimacy with her because he's going to violate the law, and the absolute is the essay to be Docha the law. So therefore, says the Ra'ah, if as far as the first bia is concerned, the bias mitzvahs yibum, there would be an essay to Docha the Lotzas in the case of Chayvim Lam, like Sota. Therefore, she requires Yibum. We're not going to allow her to have Yibum because we're always afraid that from the Bia Rishona, he's going to have a Bia Shniya when there's no mitzvah Yibum and there's nothing to override the Lotzas. But as far as Chalitza is concerned, we're definitely going to require Chalitza. And if that be the case, the Gemara's kasha here of a Lisninu is completely off the charts. It doesn't make any sense. What do you mean Lisninu? Lisninu is we should add Tzaras Sota according to Rav to the list of 15 and jack it up to 16 because there's a tour of both Yibum and Chalitza. That's not true according to the Ra'ah. The Ra'ah understands that in the case of Sota, there should be Yibum because Esei Docha Losaseh. There won't be Yibum because of the second beer, but nevertheless, as far as Chalitza is concerned, she definitely needs Chalitza. Says there, she needs Chalitza. How do we understand the Gemara's question now of a Lisninu that Tsaras Sota according to Rav should have been listed as case number 16 when the Tsara of the Sota will require Chalitza. I mentioned the Tsara. I mean, it would seem also the Sota as well requires Yibum. He says, "Bia Rishona Hutra Bahen Mishum da Asi Esse the Yavam v'Dochalosas El Midrabanan Ena Misyavmos Mishum Gzera Bia Rishona Atu Bia Shnia." If we allow Bia Rishona, he may come to do Bia Shnia. It's obvious that she requires Chalitza because on a dry level she falls for Yibum and she requires Yibum. Very interesting that Esei Docha Losas would apply here in the context of Yibum, but only vis-a-vis the first Bia. Now I understand the technicality of it and the mechanics of it because there's no mitzvah in the second Bia, but nevertheless, it's appelled to me that the Torah would require a Yibum situation which would terminate after the first Bia, and he would have to deliver again.
So the mitzvah is not on the bond.
Yes, the assumption is that she'll get pregnant from that first Bia, which I don't know what the percentage statistically of that happening is. Because otherwise, what would it mean? Go ahead, override the losas of Sota for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum, but immediately after Bia Rishona, deliver again. I mean, we must be hoping and praying that as a result of that first Bia, she's going to become pregnant, and that'll be the accomplishment of Lahaki. I'm just saying philosophically, I don't understand how this works. Mechanically, I understand that.
What's the losas Sota brother?
Well, what we're saying is that the same Isser Lav that's built into the marriage relationship with Shimon carries over with that Zika. You know, it's that same Zika. Umasha Chidash Barav Shadina Ke'erva Mishum Tuma Diksib Bekarayos Ein El Inyan Isser Tzorasa Af Tzorasa Kimosali Osim and Atorbu B'Yishniya. It takes all of her ritva. Im kidvara ma maksha gemara al Rav madulo nichlas sota im kol anoshim apochos es tzoraseyem alo chayeves hi vitzarasa bechalitza. The ena kikol arais hashnis b'mishna sena apturis af michalitza. I mean, according to the Ra'ah, who understands that when Rav says that Tzoras Sota Eina Mitzvah Benes, it means Eina Mitzvah Benes Nidirabanan, but certainly she requires Chalitza. That be the case, how can you say listen? Ma'amacha Gemara l'Rav minyon l'mute mai. Hello, after she does a shabi, it's so much in the might Tzoras Sota. L'fishena p'tura el b'na yibul lo b'na chalitza. Says the Ritva, you see on the top of the left column, she'ikar kushas haGemara he mitzoras islandus. The Rav Asi, the Gemara really wasn't asking any kasha here on Rav. The whole thrust of the Gemara was to ask a kasha on Rav Asi in the case of Tzoras islandus. Agav riyata the Rav Asi is kira gamis Rav. I remember this kind of principle from Masechet Yevamot. Like the Gemara says, why does the Mishnah at the beginning of Makis mention Ben Grusha u Ben Chalutza? It really only applies to Ben Grusha. But the Gemara answers Agav, that sometimes, there are certain words that always go together. So the Mishnah mentions them. Unbelievable. The Ritva wants to suggest that we shouldn't even mention the Shita of the Ra'ah. the Ra'ah cannot be reconciled with our Gemara, and therefore we have to throw it out. It shouldn't. Don't even give it a footnote. Pretty harsh statement. Okay, now we're getting back to that Tosfos, who's going to come up with a scenario of tsaras sara in the case of a sota, but not lebaila, but rather lebol. Picture at Tosfos hare matzinu efsharus shel tsaras sara beisus sota legabi aboel. Shari kaimel and kishem shasura lebalo kach yasura lebol. Means the following: a woman had an extramarital affair with a man. Her husband gave her a divorce. She's not allowed to go to that man. She's not allowed to have any relationship with that man, and that's considered echad lebal v'echad lepoel. Just like she can never ever have a relationship according to the law with her husband, she can never ever have a relationship with her poet. Now, what's the source for both of these isurim, echad lebal v'echad lepoel? Is the word tumah. Kishem shebe isus sota lebaila ksiv beit tumah ke'arayos. Kach be'isura leboel ksiv tumah ke'arayos. If that be the case, that the concept of arayos applies not only to the baal but also to the boel, then the boel, like the baal, should be parted from yibum, and he should part the tzara. And not only the tzara, but the tzara as well. Keep going. He gives the following example. Eishes ish zinsa im Ruven. Liacha shegirsha baila nisa l'shimon achiv shel haboel. So Ruven's the adulterer, and the woman with which he had adultery received a get from a husband and was married by Shimon. And there's no, it's very interesting. I mean, I wouldn't want to be Masada Kedushin at this wedding. I don't think it's the nicest thing in the world for Shimon to marry this woman. But let's say she does tshuva, I don't know. But it's irrelevant. There's no Isur, according to the Torah, for Shimon to marry this woman, even though she was a confirmed adulteress. But now when Shimon dies, and she falls for Yibam to Ruvain, there's an Isur Tumah to Ruvain because he's the adulterer. And therefore, and now Shimon has another wife, right? Rivka, we called her. Base below button. Now Tosfos wants to come up with Tsaras Tsar. What happens now? Yibam Levi, right? Levi now, and he's married to another woman as well, but Levi now is going to marry the Tsara of the Sota. Right? Because Shimon was married to two wives, one of whom was this Sota. And that woman, the Sota, is Asura on Reuven and only on Reuven, because he's the Boaz. Now we can construct Tsaras Tsara, because now we're going to have a second round. And what's going to happen is that Levi is going to be Miyabem, the Tsara of the Sota, who has the same status as the Sota by virtue of the halacha of Tsaras Erva. And now Levi has another wife who's the Tsara of a Tsara Sota. The Yibem Levi Achiev Hashlishi Es Tsarasa Hasota. So he's marrying a Tsara Sota. The Yeshlo Isha Cheres Milvado. Akach Mesach, who Levi dies, Nafla Shuv Liyavam Mustay Ruvain, Liyavam Mustay Ruvain, is Osa Tsaras Sota who falls for Yibum together with Sarasa, that means Levi's other wife. Shneim Pturis Milachlots Lisyamim, Harishona Mishum Tsarasot, Bashnim Mishum Tsarasot. I mean, I knew this was coming around the bend when I saw the previous paragraph, but I didn't know exactly how to work it out, stage by stage, step by step. So the bottom line of this entire discussion is Tosfos' kasha. Why does Gemara exclude the candidacy of Tsaras Sota? According to Rav, why wasn't Tsaras Sota number 16 on the list? The answer is because there's no Tsaras Tzara. Says Tosfos, I can work it out that there is a Tsaras Tzara vis-a-vis the poet. So let me just think, if we now have at our fingertips the ability to answer Tosfos, we have enough information. Let's see. We said that there's a difference between the Isur to the Boel and the Isur to the Baal. The Isur to the Baal is called Tumah. And Tumah is like an Erev. But the Isur to the Boel is a different Isur. Let's see if we can possibly figure this out. Tirtzu, Shemikema Shalom Matzina B'Tumah Sota L'Gabe Abal She'eheba Din Erev. If Torah is Ein Lahachmir B'Tumah Shalagabi Aboel Yosef Me'asher B'Tumah Shalagabi Abal the lesser Ba'af Es Soras. So I don't get it. This doesn't make any sense. He's assuming, which is fair ground, the logical equation analogy between Baal and Boel. And therefore, the power generated by a sota vis-a-vis Habal, which is the source for the Boel, cannot be, one can't be greater or more extensive than the other. So let's go back to the original. With regard to the Baal, there's no such thing as Tsaras Tzara. And therefore, we cannot extend the Boel to go beyond the Baal and have a broader application of the Erva status such that now it can patter up at Tsaras Tzara. Ein lahachmir b'tumah shalagabi aboel Yosef me'asher b'tumah lagabi abal the lesser ba af es Tsaras Tzaros. Doesn't make any sense to me. The reason why, in the case of the Baal, there's no Tsaras Tzara is because there simply is no reality of Tsaras Tzara. How would you even construct a scenario of Tsaras Tzara? Because Tsaras Tzara always assumes an Afila Shniya after Levi was Miyameh. But in the case of Sota, Levi is no different than any of the other brothers. Let me just see if that's what he says. His kashu achronim is for us amzu halo masha in isu Sota lebal in Tsaras Tzara eno machmas kuloso el machmas shemimitzius lo shayach. There is no reality of Tsaras Tzara in the case of Baal. Amal gabi abol shetitochen mitziusu. As Tosfos works it out, there is a scenario b'mitzius of Tsaras Tzara loma lo tiyoser af Tsaras Tzaros. In other words, we're not questioning the premise that there's no Tsaras Tzara in Baal. We're not questioning the premise that Boel is a spin-off of Baal. All that is crystal clear and universally accepted. But the dial of Amen Adidios cannot do an application doesn't make sense. To say that since in the case of the Baal, there's no tzaras tzara, therefore you cannot draw the conclusion of tzaras tzaras in the case of the Boa. Well, why not? Let's see who asks this question. I'm curious. Karen Ora, Gon Rav Shimon Shka, Ovetza Oris, that's all on. See if by chance we can come up with anything on our own. Well, this looks like a brick wall. What's the possibility here? Sorry. You could give maybe a technical answer. But you remember that we've discussed in the past the possibility that Sarah is a new category. It's not that we're going back to Ashes Achim. And Sarah is also a new category. So there's a new erva that the Torah classified in the case of Sarah. Well, where's the source for Sarah in the case of the Boa? You're out there in the wild. You're suspended in midair because if you're going to go back to the Baal, excuse me, there is no category of Sarah in the Baal. If anybody gives that answer. I mean, I think I could fit it into footnote number Yud Gimel, although he doesn't spell it out. He says, Isuro shel Boel, who betolda mikoch Isuro shel Abba. Al-Kain, kol Isur shelo nimtza Kain bebal, afim enu elu mishum chisonei chetimtza, I efshe shei aser bebo. Not exactly what we said. I mean, maybe I could push it in, but we were emphasizing the fact that there's a new category called Tzaras Sarah, and the Torah gives her the status of an Erev. But you can't apply that to the Boel because the whole entity of Tzaras Sarah is derived from the Baal. Yeah.
And the Torah came from Mitzvah.
Let's see. There were two diukim that we had. First of all, the word litzrar, and secondly, the extra, it could have said latzur instead of litzrar, but yeah.
So, say that wouldn't apply to the Boel.
Correct. That extra drasha would not apply to Boel because Boel is a derivative from the Baal, and in Baal we don't have the litzrar. It just doesn't apply. I mean, we have plenty of cases to use the litzrar. In fact, we have at least 15 cases, but we don't have it in the case of the Boel, of the Baal. So the footnote is not quoting Rav Shimon Shka. In the text of the Yalkut V'Urim, he's going to quote Rav Shimon Shka. But first he wants to add a little bit of fuel to the fire and add another question on top of the first question. Odhikdu, halo me'achashin nifteres soras sota mi'ivu. Shuv choseresi bi'ili iser eshes ak mimkein af im ein koach. V'shem soras sota liftares sorasa mikomak of yeshel lefotra im shem ervas eshes ach shelo b'makom mitzvah. Shuhu kechol harayis hapochus sorsein michalitza viv. And now he's assuming that the din of tzaras sota, the status is that of eshes ach, and therefore the tzara of the tzaras sota is the tzara of an erva. You can call it tzaras tzara, but she's basically a tzaras erva. What's the erva of eshes ach? The only thing is, I'm not sure that everybody agrees that Saras Erva is Eishes Ach. Remember, we quoted Reb Chaim once. That Reb Chaim held that Arab, the Erev of Eishesach, is what projects her into the mitzvah of Yibum, not taking her out of the mitzvah of Yibum. It would have to be another Erev. And therefore, Reb Chaim, I think, assumed, like we mentioned before, that there's a new category of an Erev called Tsaras Erev. Here it's Reb Shimon Shkop, Alpi Darko. I guess Darko means we mentioned him earlier. The Shnei Dine Erva Heim Liyibo. Aleph, Iser Erva HaOser Biyibo. Umemela Mafkia. Oh, that's not the case of an islanders, right? Umafkia Gam Din Chalitza. Mishum Shekol Sheinu Ola Liyibum Eino Ola Lechalitza. Mitzad Din Zeh Bilvad Lo Paka Zikasa. Elam Kain Monua Hi Legamri Yibum. Well, in Yeshba Zika L'Shar HaAchim HaMutarim Lahem Lo Paka Zikas HaAf Me'ach Zeh Al Af Sheinu Yochel Lo Liyavma V'Lo Lachlotz Ba. I don't remember all the details of Reb Shimon Shkop. Might be kedai to do a chazara on that very quickly. I don't want to take too much time on this, but what page was it on? Oh, maybe it's on page Gimel. So he has two drashos. Let's see. Likes it. Start with this. No, I don't think that's the one. I think I'm on the wrong page. Just all right. I don't think that was the one. Right now, it's eluding me. I thought he was talking about the case. What was the case? Was it Islands? Let's see it one more time. Gimel. Maybe it is here. One. Lule mitzvahs yibum lo hoyba isu eishes ha. Fels klalia. Lamed ches. Mochen uvur sham shekol erva she'en ba sibas nefila. That's erva mochen mitzvah. Lomar sheyesh ba nefila yibum. There's Esteros. If he's a Yekon to Lule Alitzer, he's Esteros. Here, false Bali, Afashi. Inas Mahmas. Benkach, Neseres, I don't think that that's the paragraph he's referring to. Does he tell you? I mean, maybe in the footnote here he tells you where the Reb Shimon is. Just a quick review of that Reb Shimon might be helpful here. Sham. I hate when he uses the word sham. It always drives me a little bit crazy. And the previous footnote you downloaded. Let's read this one more time and see if we can work this out. The Tiritz of Shimon Shkop, how are we doing on the clock? Not too great. The Tiritz Rabbi Shimon Shkop, Al Pi Darko, Shnei Dini Erva Hem Liyibum. Number one, Iser Erva Ha'oser B'Yibum. Umemela Mafkia Gam Din Chalitza. Mishum kol she'eno ola libum eno ola chalitza ach mitzad din ze bilvad lo pak'ah zikasa elim kein manua hi legamre miyibum vechalitza aval im yesh ba zika l'shar ha'achim hamutarim ba, she's only an erva to one of the achim, lo pak'ah zikasa ach me'ach zeh. That's a gewaltige chiddush. Saying that even vis-a-vis Ruvain, that she's an erva, there still is some zikas. Al afshena yochel lo liyamav lo lachlotz ba. Number two, ptur erva nilmad mi oleha mafki legamri is zikasa me ach zeh shehi erva olam. Ubekol tzoras erva gilsa Torah she'af hi bechlal ptur erva mafkia zikasa legamri umachzira l'shem ervas ishes ach kidei shetiftar ima afes tzoras sa ach b'tzoras sota Dilegabe abal, afsha osasa osa haTorah karayos liyidibu, ein hechrech shegilsa haTorah bozeh sheyesh b'ptur erva, af le'inyan hafkas zikosa. El yitochen sherak mina osa haTorah miyibu v'chalitza ke'erva. Memela paka zikasa mishum she'asura kol ha'achim. Becholchen nitches legamre mibayis seh paka zika af below ptur erva. Mikevet she'ein nafkemina beinim apturu mikoach ha'aleha levenim imidin kol she'en ol yibim en ol chalitza ein lanu hechrech she'asasa Torah ki erva gam le'inyan olev im kein shuv ein lanu mekar litzoras sota legabi boel shepaka zikasa legabav kimiach she'ein bo ptur oleha im kein lo paka zikasa af legabi abal haboel kemen she'eno dechuya mishar ha'achim. The afshem menua himi l'syamim lachlotzlo b'nefila zu. Mikol achar sheyavmo li acher v'nasta ki ishto lechol davar is yibumo mafkia es iser ha'eshes ach sheba af me'aboel. Ini motzinu sheyibum echod ha'achim mafkia mimeno es iser ha'eshes ach mikol achim li'olam uchsheyomus hamiyamim lo te'oser al shara ach achiv machmas ha'ach harishon el she'en yibumo matir el li'achim she'ayu bichlal zika rishonim. Al kein kol tsaras erva neseres af b'nefila shniya mishum shepaka zikasa ela legamre mikoch al lev veha litzva. Al besota ein din erva le'inyan afkaz zika ela rak litchosa miyibum vechalitza. Now, this is something we'll have to go over again and again. I don't know why my luck has it that on Thursday, end of the week, when I'm pretty exhausted, we get the most difficult, challenging pieces. Okay, that's the way it goes. So we'll see. I'm going to try to see if I can look this over the next few days. And not, we'll simply go on to the next sugi, which is related to this sugi. It's not a brand new sugi. So let me